This is Cody McLean from the Mindhack podcast, a place where we explore the routines, mindset, and experiences of successful people in their field, whatever that field may be. So today we're looking at what it means to build a startup. We're looking at some of the challenges that you'll be faced with in building a startup, with not only validating your idea, but also what are the questions you need to be asking yourself. Maybe how would you build a startup as a non-technical founder? Should you, say, have a co-founder, or should you just be managing contractors? Tons of this and much more relevant to anybody interested in entrepreneurship. So my guest today is Brent Summers. He is the founder of Code Free Startup, an online learning platform that teaches others how to build a startup using visual design tools like Bubble.is. As somebody who's been in the early phases of learning how to code, I found this to be an intriguing way to build a startup, much more quickly without the need to know code. It's a visual design tool that allows anybody to quickly pick up a way to build a startup, an online software as a service application without knowing code. But that's not actually what interested me about Brent. No, he has a website called launchingmyself.com. And on that site, he publishes a list of previous companies and products he's built, and he gives more or less a sort of case study on the success or failure of that project. In many ways, he's the first entrepreneur/developer I've seen approach the development of a single founder startup by building something that honestly doesn't require a lot of maintenance or even support once it's been coded and launched. What I find most fascinating is that Brent took a concept from the online marketing world of building a personal brand and selling online courses, because in most cases, once you put the course out there, it's going to continue to generate money for you, similar to the Tim Ferriss 4-Hour Workweek concept. So this was a phenomenal conversation, and if you're at all interested in learning a new concept on, say, becoming a solo founder without knowing code and basically building your next startup, then this is a great episode. So please welcome Brent Summers. So on your website, Brent, you have this algorithm that you refer to. Can you explain what that is a little bit?
Yeah, so I really developed it based on the way I was building products maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when I first realized that something in common with all of my failed projects was that I waited too long to develop a business model. So as soon as I started building things with the mindset of revenue first, then things just started to make more sense. I started to, instead of just building and waiting for value to show up, I started building with value in mind first. And I found that that was a great way to get people to actually pay for what you're using. And then that turns into a business a lot faster. It sounds simple, but it's one of those things that you sometimes need to organically discover. So for launching myself, I wanted to see if I could apply some of the same principles to everything else I was making online, which primarily is just articles when I write and videos that I record to YouTube that are mostly just educational, related to some of the teaching I did when I was running the Code Free Startup. So when it came to coming up with a set of rules, I wanted to just see if I could hold myself accountable and make a certain set of guidelines to see if, okay, this was a good idea to write something similar to this. Is it a good idea to record a video similar to this based on the views, the data. And so the site hopefully will just tell me, okay, this was a good idea, this was not a good idea. So I can be a little bit more objective with things I make in the future.
And so in some ways, you developed a business model for making businesses.
Yeah, it's a little bit meta, but yeah, exactly. So, a lot of what I thought about when I was running my previous company was how to get startups off the ground with very limited resources. It's been referred to as bootstrapping in the past, and now there's a bit more of kind of an indie hacker sense. That's kind of a new term that's been really growing recently, but it really just comes down to, you're building a resource constrained business. So how do you do that? And really it comes down to focusing on the value that you're providing people and how soon you can either figure out if something's not working or if something is working.
So then you talked about having a revenue focused model prior. Now, you had other companies that I assume you had another focus other than making revenue, but most people think, you want to focus on revenue from the beginning. So can you explain sort of the opposite of focusing on revenue and the problem and maybe the pro cons with that?
Yeah. So while revenue first businesses are pretty standard in the bootstrapping world, I'd say in the VC backed startup world, which I came from traditionally, after I worked at a startup that was VC backed, really high growth. The focus is oftentimes not on revenue and instead on building out features, building out a certain set of customers that can scale really quickly.
Mhm.
And so really, coming from that mindset that kind of really perpetuates the culture in Silicon Valley, I had a tough time getting away from that because you start out thinking, okay, I'm going to build something that's going to scale. It's going to be the next Uber. It's going to be the next Airbnb. How do I do that? And so you kind of just start building and you build and build and build. And then you go out and you show someone what you've built. And then it turns out that you've missed maybe 10 things along the road. So, when you're building with a revenue first model, you are restricted to kind of putting something out there, getting feedback a lot earlier. And, it's really coming back to the MVP model of, building something that's valuable from day one and then testing it, getting feedback, and then kind of building from there.
Right. And so you mentioned the indie hacker model. And so I've never actually heard of that before, but I can see where your perspective is on that. And so a lot of the businesses, and I don't really know if I would call them businesses, I'm sure that we've all seen Shark Tank, and you have some people who go up and maybe they're selling a interesting piece of clothing, but the sharks would typically say like, this is not a business, you have a product. And so on your website, you mention a lot of these types of businesses, like it was the Alfred Productivity Master, which allowed you to create your own custom workflow. And that's where I found your website, is by, you had that on Product Hunt one day. And so would you describe that as a business, or would you describe that as something else?
Yeah, so I describe it as a business, but it's a business in really just the sense that it earns money while I sleep. So it really comes down to the concept of a business and something that can earn money that's separate from your time. That's really the type of business that I really want to focus on. And I think can really be the best ways to generate wealth, to really ultimately get freedom, which is kind of my goal when looking to start a project. And so, kind of comes back to, one of the oracles of Silicon Valley, Naval Ravikant, the founder of AngelList. He always says that you really can't build wealth by renting out your time. You need to build a business to really gain freedom. And so I always think about that. And, the Alfred Productivity product is a good example of that. It's a pretty small business in that, doesn't earn me that much money, but, I just have a email workflow that sends me an email every time there's a new sale. And so you just kind of see those hit your inbox and you're like, oh, hey, there it goes. It's a product that lives on a website, has a few acquisition channels and it makes money through those acquisition channels. And so those kind of businesses can be referred to as a lifestyle business. That's something that, Tim Ferriss really popularized, but, but ultimately it is a product. It's a business that I could potentially scale up. I just decided not to because, I think when I launched that business, I learned that it was probably going to be more difficult because Alfred is such a niche product. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a business and a product.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does sound a little bit Tim Ferriss-y with the 4-hour work week. Is that what inspired you to create this type of model?
Originally, yeah, I'd say, going way back, like a lot of people, I read 4-Hour Work Week right in the midst of the financial crisis in 2009, 2010. And at that point, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And it looked like the entrepreneurship was a pretty good way to go. And so, at that point, I think, the startup world was just starting to get pretty exciting with a lot of the post bubble burst companies coming on the scene. Ruby on Rails was the popular framework that kind of exploded and Twitter started, using it and Airbnb launched. And so I think I got caught up in that a little bit. And then when I read Tim's book, that's when I realized that there was probably a different way to do this that fit my goals, that were keeping things a little bit smaller. Because obviously, you see the upside of those giant VC-backed businesses, but the downsides you really don't see until you've been in one.
Right.
And, I was an early employee at a startup that grew really quickly and I had a ton of fun there, but you also see some downsides of that model. And you can see how it can wear down the founders pretty quickly. And, if things don't go great and you don't keep that hockey stick growth up. So yeah, I think Tim's work obviously was kind of seminal in the field. And now, people who are building on it, I'd say like Paul Jarvis just wrote a great book, Company of One, that really emphasizes the things you need to build to make a really successful solo venture. And then, the site Product Hunt and Indie Hackers both have really great communities. A lot of them are solo founders and people who are building businesses that are, just really resource constraint, but then ultimately end up providing a ton of value.
And that reminds me a little bit of the model from Basecamp. And I think it was Jason Fried, who's the CEO of Basecamp, who's being interviewed on the Tim Ferriss podcast, where they were talking about how he actually turned down funding because he knew if he took that VC money that he would have to add 100 employees. They would have to grow to this huge company. And he asked himself whether that was something he really wanted to be doing. And you sell the company, then you start a new one. And that seems to be this existing model of startups, is that you grow really, really big or you flop and then
Exactly.
you start it all over again. And I've had that same question asking myself, do I really want to do that? And I've had a lot of successes, but I've asked myself in some ways, I'd rather not have to exert as much effort and keep going on this cycle of sorts. So what I find interesting about what you do is that you took this model that's primarily seen in the online marketing world, where you have these marketing people who will create these online courses. And the great thing about that is, of course, is that you only have to create the course once. And then after that, it's just selling. And a lot of them don't end up actually selling their course. They sell their brand, which as an indirect result will sell their course. And so I think you're the first I've seen where you're a developer and you're applying that model instead of creating these courses. In some ways you have, but you're also applying them to figuring out what's an easy app that I can create that's going to solve a problem in a certain niche or a market. And so that brings me to my next question, which is, so you have the development skills, you know what you're doing, but where do you come up with the ideas? Because there's a lot of developers that are great at developing, but they need a leader. They need somebody to tell them what to work on. They need a workflow that they can work within and a team. And so how did you not only decide to become an entrepreneur, but then how do you decide what you're going to build next?
Yeah. So I really think the core concept of being able to build something that people want comes down to having two skill sets, right? You need to learn how to build something. You need to learn how to sell something. And I think having both of those skill sets is very rare. And it's also something that's very difficult because they're really opposites. You're either in code talking to a computer or you're out there talking to people, and people who are good at one tend to not be good at the other. So I'd say I originally came from a sales and marketing background. I grew out a sales team at a startup and then was self-taught when it came to development. And so I think the path that I took was pretty eye-opening in a sense because I realized that, hey, there aren't a lot of people out there that can do both pretty well. And I really want to build out those skills. And then once I kind of realized that, it is something that's very difficult to build out, I tried to distill some of those principles of how do you sell things? Because I think there are a lot more developers out there who, just build software for other developers, or, they build things that maybe, can maybe speed up an existing process that developers have and have some success there. But when it comes to then building something for the masses, building anything that's a business or consumer product, they have a lot of trouble. So yeah, I think, my path to entrepreneurship was definitely getting into the startup world early and then realizing that, if you could build and sell something, that was a pretty dangerous combination. And then, when it comes to what ideas I choose to build, I'd say really just looking at what works and what you are able to build as a solo founder. I think it is definitely limiting and there are some upsides to getting VC because if you do take funding, you can really fuel ideas that might take 5 to 10 years to become profitable. Just look at Uber, still figuring it out, but obviously they've found a lot of demand for their product. And so on the bootstrap side of things, it really puts you into a different mindset of like, okay, hey, I might not be able to start the next Uber, but I could probably start a pretty great productized service business where you can start out consulting. Let's say you are consulting on how to build websites on a certain platform. And then as you get better at building on that platform, you could develop an automated tool to build better on that platform. And then that automated tool becomes, the number one import tool to put things on WordPress. And so you can really develop a pretty great software as a service company just by, consulting and then slowly leveraging those skills to build something that does the job better than you can. And then that also has the benefit of separating your time from the equation, which is the ultimate goal when, building a business, something that, you can choose to take a week off and you're not going to take a huge hit, because your software is kind of working for you in the background.
Yeah, and it also brings up an interesting point is even just bringing up Basecamp again, is that they started out as a web design company and they developed their own project management system for them, but then that ended up becoming a product that they ended up selling and that they're most well known for. And there's a lot of companies who've ended up having a product, but then they develop something internally and then that ends up becoming what they end up selling. And when you do that, you're developing it from a point of need from your business perspective. And in some ways that can be a more effective thing to sell than if you start out to try to create a product to solve a problem, because you are forced to use your own product.
Exactly. Yeah. The consulting model has a ton of upside, especially because going back to your previous question about how you come up with ideas, if you're talking to clients and you're learning about their problems, where's a better place to start than by saying to a client, hey, I know I'm solving your problem by building this custom thing out, but what if I built this piece of software that you could use? That's a really great way to get started. And also going back to Basecamp, I think, an important point about their story and, and how they started that company and why it's such a model that people try to repeat is that being in the position of, building a profitable software business that can choose to raise money at a certain point or choose not to is just, it's such an advantage because, if you already have revenue coming in the door and then you raise VC money or you just take in, a couple outside investors, you have the choice to, put that money to good use and then eventually use the profit to pay back investors. You can buy them out. The problem and really where I see most of the issues in the early stage startup world is the small team that takes a lot of money early on for a promising idea. And then the founders, they look back maybe 3 months in and they realize that they're not actually the founders of this company. They're really just the first employees and that the investors are the ones that are actually driving this thing. And they're saying, hey, we need X amount of growth. If the product's not working, you got to, pivot it 4 times before we're going to give up. And so that can really drain people. So you look at the Basecamp model and, being in that situation where you say, hey, you know what, maybe I will raise money eventually, but maybe 5 years in when I have a solid revenue model first and, have a team and can decide, oh, maybe we just want to add some growth. It's a much more advantageous spot to be in.
Right. That reminded me of a book by an author named Felix Dennis. And his book is called How to Get Rich. One of the world's greatest entrepreneurs shares his secrets. And it's all about how to get rich as an entrepreneur. And in the book, he mentions how most entrepreneurs who end up taking VC money actually end up not getting a lot of money, is that it all really goes to the investors. They're the ones who make the money. And so a lot of founders actually end up getting screwed out of their own companies.
Yeah, it's something that, is not often publicized because, the magazine covers are really the glitz and the glam. That's what you want as a founder, right? You want the cover shot with your arms are crossed and you're smiling and, you've made it. But then, the fine print is that unless you're hitting that growth curve square on and you're getting hockey stick growth, you're taking more and more bites out of your equity every time you raise money. And so, what ends up happening in a lot of situations is that to continue to fuel this thing, you need to have less and less of your company be owned by you. And, that's great if you end up selling your company for $10 billion. But what ends up happening in a lot of cases is you end up, selling your company for a lot less than that and then walking away with a lot less than you would have gotten if you just kept it small and kept, 80 to 90% of it.
Yeah, in some ways, we can segregate this issue down to a question of, would you rather get a VC who gives you maybe $15-20 million to go build a startup, or would you rather have the promise of a steady income of, say, like $3,000 or $4,000 a month for the next 10 years? And would you agree? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, that question really comes down to impact. I think a lot of people who take VC money, they really believe their product can have a huge impact and they want to just scale it up as much as possible, no matter the cost or the potential downside. And so when it comes to the other end, which is the product that, makes money while you're off, I don't know, sipping Mai Tai on the beach. That's what people think everyone who follows the 4-hour work week does.
Yeah.
That model really comes down to more heavily weighting on the freedom side of things, where you can choose whether to grow a business or choose to let it sit at its current growth rate and maybe take a month off and do some travel or spend time with family. And the downside is that businesses started with that model end up reaching a lot less people, but that's okay. I think the Kevin Kelly model of 1,000 true fans, while it does have some flaws, it also does highlight something super important, which is that you don't need a product to reach uber scale to have an impact in a lot of people's lives. I think you can impact thousands or potentially tens of thousands, and that's enough.
Can you explain the concept of 1,000 true fans?
Sure. Yeah. So Kevin Kelly, founder of Wired magazine and tech futurist, he put out this really popular article that explained how you really don't need to achieve a level of fame like a rock star to have a good amount of success, that you really need a true following of fans. And he called it 1,000 true fans. And that number, I think some people take issue with, and I agree, unless you have 1,000 people that are willing to buy absolutely everything you sell and they're super committed, that number might be actually closer to 5 or 10,000. But the concept still holds true. If you build a really dedicated audience, we're starting to see things on sites like Patreon and podcasts that are supported by backers, where if you just have a solid group of fans, then they can supply you with that necessary income to just focus on creating and making cool things.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant new concept about actually just building a long-term brand and being able to focus on creating great content.
Yeah, definitely. And it's difficult because, you really can't see how it will turn into a business if you're just, recording YouTube videos and writing articles. I think a lot of people kind of get lost in that, where they're starting to develop an audience. Maybe they have a small email list, and it isn't until you see someone who comes along with either a paid subscription model to site content or paid videos that you really realize that it can be a business if you just record useful information. That it just comes down to being helpful to as many people as you can.
Yeah, and I think of Marquis Brown, who runs the MKBHD channel on YouTube, where
he's great,
very well known for reviewing like phones and new tech products. And I remember looking back at his very first video, I think maybe he was 12 or 13, and the quality was crap. But when he was a kid, he found an interest, and then he just pursued that interest and that passion. And eventually now that turned into a very successful business for him. And I think a lot of other people, especially when we get into our adult years, we think of revenue, we think of money first, and not necessarily what are we actually interested in. And so you end up having a lot of entrepreneurs who start stuff and they aren't really interested in it. And so to piggyback on this model of how do you keep your ambitions in check? Because when you're a kid, you can have unlimited ambitions. You want to change the world. You want to do all these things. And I think it's great now for kids who are learning how to code is that they have these great ambitions and then they just develop something without concept of limitations in mind or money in mind or any of those. They just do what they want to. And when you tend to get older now, you have to sort of keep your ambitions in check. And so in Silicon Valley and startups, we have startup founders, who want to change the world. They want to be the next Uber and they go out and try and raise money. But on the other hand, I'm sure you had this inflection point where you decided that you're going to pull back from that you would rather have a steady, stable income and accept that you're not going to have the next Uber. What was that thought process? What was that inflection point for you like?
Yeah, I think the inflection point happened just in realizing that the businesses that you start don't need to have an Uber-like impact for you to still get a lot from them. And to your previous point about people who don't end up enjoying what they do, they pull back in their ambitions. Maybe they just see a company that is a good opportunity and they run for it, and ultimately they don't end up enjoying, or really find out what, if they agree with what that mission is. And I think, what's led me down this path is in realizing that in starting any business, there are things that you'll enjoy doing and there are things you won't enjoy doing. I do think that you need to be above all interested in helping the types of people that use your product. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen with early stage companies is they see, let's say, an industry that really could use this type of software, but they don't actually care about the customers. So let's say they go out and they see, okay, this app for plumbers is going to be great. And then what they don't realize is that, they've just signed themselves up to deal with plumbers, for the next 5 to 10 years. And if they aren't actually super interested in helping them, then it's going to be a drag. And so one of the things I found in starting my last business was, I was a startup founder myself. And as soon as I started working with other people who wanted to start early stage businesses, I realized, this is super rewarding just by itself, helping people get off the ground. These folks that are very resource constrained, they're not in Silicon Valley, they don't have a technical background. Those kind of goals that they had, those were things that I would help them even if it wasn't a business. So I think that's an important way to kind of keep your ambition in check while still just aligning yourself with your customers, so that, even on your worst day, you still want to get up and talk to your customers, because you're never going to be able to escape them unless you fully automate your business. And I don't think anyone really wants to run that kind of business anyway.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I still have great friends that are still in this midst where they're an entrepreneur, they've been running a business, but they can't be sick. They can't take a vacation because everything runs through them. And that would be a whole nother conversation about how to actually scale and systemize your business so that you're not at the center of it. But one of the interesting things I've noted is I'm sure you've heard of AppSumo.com, where they, by Noah Kagan, where they have various daily deals. And they always have some new software and app that they're selling for a crazy, ridiculously low amount that just seems like too good to be true. And a lot of these apps are niches of existing industries of problems that haven't been solved before. Something I can think of is like missingletter.com, which is an app that will automatically take your blog posts that you publish on WordPress, and then it'll create a year-long campaign to republish parts of, let's say, quotes or text or images, all looking different, and you can schedule them out to post on your Twitter account over the next year so that you're not just sharing your blog post once. And so that seems like a great idea. And I doubt it requires a lot of maintenance on their end. And I also thought maybe that would be brilliant. If you can think of all these little problems that exist in the online marketing world or with developers or entrepreneurs, and you can create a SaaS product that you develop and it's pretty much kind of runs on its own.
Yep.
Is that something that you've been kind of dabbling in?
Yeah. So when it comes to something like Missing Letter, I think I'm not sure how the founders arrived at that idea, but I have a hunch, and it's kind of my product philosophy that if you start out by solving your own problems, you usually run into things that other people have problems with too. And so that's how a lot of good B2B software in the startup space has been created. It's, okay, I was running my last company and I realized that this part of it was a real hassle. And what if it was a lot easier? What's something that I found out that I could automate that I could then turn into a software product and help other people with? So yeah, that's kind of a core philosophy with a lot of the projects I start. Is I always make sure that at the end of the day, if the project fails, at least I'll be one user. So it will never be a complete failure because at least I'm solving my own problem with it. And then, yeah, it tends to work out when you solve your own problem that other people have the same issue, especially if it's in a niche like, starting a software business or social media or online marketing.
Yeah, that's always the most organic way to grow. I think it's still riskier than, say, building something that is revenue focused, or maybe it isn't, because you're focusing on your passion. You're not just developing something for the money. And then you realize things get hard, and then you just lose motivation and you just kind of drop it off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it could be something that you're interested in solving your own problem, but also the revenue first model just makes a lot of sense. If it's easy subscription or you're building a piece of content that you can sell, I think when it comes to building something revenue first, it doesn't necessarily have to be the number one requirement when jumping into something. But I think, especially when I follow this rule set on launching myself, I think about, okay, it's really just going through a checklist. And is this something a problem that I'm solving for myself? Check. Okay, good. I can move on to the next one. It's kind of like how instead of validating with someone else first and trying to get an idea out there, you're kind of putting it through its own challenge and its own checklist first. So if it doesn't pass the criteria of having a good business model or being profitable potentially from day one, or if the business model just seems way too complicated, okay, I'm going to need to collect user data and then I'm going to need to sell it. And then I need to make sure the users don't find out that I'm selling their data, a la Facebook. That's not something that you can kind of start and get profitable really quickly.
Now, when you've created your previous projects, I notice on your website that you have some of it'll say status failed and it'll have the launch date. So how do you develop the metrics and let alone the discipline to say create various KPIs or metrics that you're measuring yourself against? And how do you decide, okay, if I don't do X by this date, I'm going to drop that project and I'm going to start on something else. And that's really difficult for a lot of people because we have that sunk cost fallacy where we put all this time and effort and money into it. We want to keep going and it can just end up being more of a drain.
Definitely. Yeah. It's so hard to kill your darlings. And especially when you've poured your time into something and you really just want to continue to build it, you know there's something there, but it's just not happening. It's really, really hard to walk away. And so that was one of my big goals last year, was just trying to figure out which metrics I wanted to focus on, because I think one problem for founders is that there can be way too many metrics early on. You set up your Google Analytics dashboard and you're kind of off to the races. Okay, I need to worry about the top of the funnel, the bottom of the funnel, everything in the middle, what metrics are important. And I think if you strip away all the metrics and just focus on one, which in my case, I've been focusing on revenue, everything tends to fall into place. And, I can't get revenue without page views. I can't get revenue without converting users and having a solid growth funnel in place. And so if you track just one metric, you can kind of come back to all the others eventually. But yeah, focusing on just one from the start is super helpful. And, and when it comes to, choosing when to walk away from a project, I've been guilty of just keeping projects going for way too long, for building something and wasting my time because I think, ultimately it's going to have a chance, and then, it launches and then there's a little spike, maybe a couple hundred users sign up and then it just doesn't really go anywhere. And I think it's not a situation where you can just launch something and then it will either take off or it won't. I think there's just levels of how hard will this product be to grow. I think I've had products out there that I know if I had maybe spent another couple years working on, or, if I had decided to hire a huge growth team, I think eventually they would have gotten there. But, I think that one of the great things about building multiple products and just the experience of launching multiple things is you realize that some things just naturally take off by themselves. And I remember, my most successful project, the Code Free Startup, as soon as it launched, I was like, oh, this is what it's like. This is what it's like, to put something out there that instantly gets traction and people start talking about and word of mouth spreads and you just start getting users and then the SEO comes. And I remember that feeling of, okay, like I'm not just pushing a rock up a hill. Now everything that I do just has a lot more impact because the idea itself is just spreading easier by itself. So that's how I think about that.
Yeah, once you get that validation from having at least even a little bit of user growth, that is wildly rewarding and motivating. But it can be so hard to get to that initial peak so that you can get on that other side. And obviously, there's still mountains ahead of you, but once you get that first validation, it makes it a lot easier going forward.
Yeah.
But I want to ask, since you've mentioned it a few times, what is your current revenue? Like, how much money do you make on average from your projects?
So I recently just sold my education company, the Code Free Startup. And, at the peak, we were doing about 12K of monthly recurring revenue.
Mhm.
And, I think the exit we had was a pretty great multiple. And I'm currently in a spot where I am working on new things. And that's ultimately why launching myself was put out there to be the way that I grade those new things that I built. But yeah, I think, my biggest on ramp with the Code Free Startup was when I was consulting, and I was pretty much just, I was paying San Francisco rent. It was really expensive. I had to consult a lot to, have enough money to still be comfortable. I was fortunate to kind of be consulting early stage companies and building applications for them because, as you know, it's fairly lucrative to do that. It's a skill set that's in demand, especially out in the Bay Area. But yeah, I mean, I'd kind of gone through this process of, building small apps that would maybe make $100 here and there. And it was super frustrating. And then, I think when I identified the need for the Code Free Startup and building kind of an education marketplace built on a subscription model, as soon as I put those pieces together, it was a pretty insanely fast on-ramp to sustainable revenue. And I kind of had a 60-day window where I recorded the first 3 courses. I found a community of people that I knew I could launch to. And as soon as I launched there, and then later on Product Hunt, I went from $0 to $3,000 in recurring revenue in a matter of like 60 to 90 days. So, I think that's the hardest thing when starting out is, if you are currently selling your time, whether it's in a full-time job or you're consulting or freelancing, you are going to need to get to that point where you're just making sustainable money, sustainable revenue. And if you have a considerable savings or a rich uncle, that's awesome. but if not, you're really going to have to figure out how to get up to that point so that you can spend a full time on the venture that is making money. So,
Right.
I find that happens a lot in the indie hacker space where, someone prices their product too low, or they just haven't done enough validation. And then they launch and it's like, okay, great. It's making $500 a month, but unfortunately that's not enough to quit my full-time job. And I just don't foresee this ever being a thing. And, I think the problem with that is that, it's really discouraging, and I think that a lot of people could benefit from just continuing to try out ideas because, the ones that there are some products and business ideas that will only make $500 a month at their peak. Maybe you've selected 2, you're in a niche that just doesn't have a big enough addressable market, or your marketing is just never really going to get the message out there. So yeah, I think, ultimately when it comes to bringing revenue into the picture early on, you can get a clearer sense of like, should I move on from this thing? But if you don't, it can be a pretty long road to get there.
Now you said we with the Code Free Startup. Was that just you, or did you have other developers that you were working with?
So I always had a bunch of contractors that I pulled in for various help with that project. That's another thing that I kind of learned along the way. When I was first starting out building ideas, I thought, okay, great. I'm going to, get my company incorporated and I'm going to hire some W-2 employees and it's going to be awesome. And, I realized really early on that, the way that remote work, especially in the last year or two, has kind of transformed how jobs get done. I'm sure you know this just from your background in virtual, assistance and virtual support, but it's really cool how you can just kind of pull in people when you need them to help. So I say we just because I had someone at a team of 2 that would come and help me with growth projects when I needed things done. And I had a developer to lean on when things got difficult, and I had an API that was giving me trouble. So I had a small team of contractors that I kind of just leaned on for certain things. But besides that, it was mostly me. I recorded all the courses, did all the built the platform, and did all the marketing. So it was a big effort early on.
And what is your opinion on whether you should do a contractor versus a co-founder?
So it really depends. The old adage is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that it really depends what type of business you're building. and the type of relationship you have with a potential co-founder. Because with the co-founder, you'll probably find, if your skills complement each other, that you will be able to go a lot farther and you'll be able to just do less. Because the unsexy truth of running a business is there's just a ton of stuff to get done. And, if you have someone that really shares the values that you have and has the same exact goal in mind, like, that's awesome. And I'm all for it. I'd say the downside is you often get a co-founder that has a slightly different value structure or a different work schedule, and it can be one of the biggest sources of friction and the biggest source of failure for startups early on. And so, I think if you have an idea, you're able to execute it by yourself mostly, or get it to a point where you can at least get enough revenue to hire someone part-time, then I'm a big fan of the solo founder strategy, because ultimately, you retain more equity and you have more freedom. It's like going to the movie theater by yourself. You get to choose exactly what movie you want to see, how big you want your bucket of popcorn to be, and no one else has a say. And so, that level of freedom, when it comes to just being a solo founder, is pretty hard to beat.
Yeah, I'm currently in a fairly interesting situation with Support Ninja, where I own the majority of the company, but I have a CEO who actually runs it, but he isn't a co-founder. I'm the only founder of the company. And so I'm able to have a team of people that are running the company reliably. They report to me, but I'm generally out of the daily operations. So I don't have to deal with the stress of that.
Yeah.
And the downside is I'm not able to apply my expertise and my brilliance to optimizing every facet of the organization. But on the upside, I have more of a work-life balance. I'm able to work on these other projects like book, like this podcast, etc. All of those things, which genuinely interest me more than, say, if I was just devoting all my time as a startup founder, just trying to focus on growth and solving all these problems, etc.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you kind of hit on the major point there, which is, the freedom to choose, right? If you had a co-founder in that situation, they might not feel great about you spending slightly less time on the business to work on the podcast or the book. And, being in a position where you can put someone in place to run the day-to-day and kind of automate yourself, or you're really just, you're hiring yourself out of the business, is one of those ultimate steps. It's kind of, along with ultimately selling a company, it's one of the best ways to free up your time to do things that you want, whether it's another project, whether it's just long-term projects inside the current business. I've seen a lot of people who they will put a CEO in place and then they kind of become just like a freelancer in their own company, where they kind of go team to team and kind of get involved in whatever project is super interesting to them. And I think that's a great avenue too, because, ultimately coming back to that concept of flexibility and freedom, you have the ability to choose what you want to work on. And that's one of the most fulfilling things at the end of the day.
Now, even after that, after having a CEO and they're running the company, in some ways that gave me one of my many various existential crises, because when I sold my last company, there was a period of time of exploration, and I had a bunch of money and I started flying airplanes and scuba diving and traveling, all these things that I didn't know that I necessarily wanted to do, because when I was younger, I was always focusing my time on building this company. And then after kind of giving up control, even though I still own the company of Support Ninja, is that it kind of left me feeling empty of like, what am I going to do next? What is my purpose? As Simon Sinek says, that we need to all have an underlying why, an underlying reason for what we're doing. And I was kind of empty and I didn't really know what to do next. And I was kind of, I don't know. So I'm curious, on your front, did you ever have any kind of crisis of what is your why? So you build these products up, but what is the underlying foundational philosophy that you have that keeps you going? What are you trying to do, in the grand scheme of things in your life in general with all these various projects? Do you have any goal in mind?
Yeah. So, it's a big question. And, I can definitely relate to that existential crisis when you finally have reached the goal, but you've realized that, the whole reason that you were working to reach the goal was actually the meaning. And,
yes.
and now you're at that point where you're looking at yourself like, oh my God, what am I going to do with myself?
Yeah.
I had a brief period where, I took a few months off once the Code Free startup had grown to a certain point and was kind of running, without needing my day-to-day involvement. And it was enjoyable for maybe the first 10 days. And then, and then I started to realize, okay, I think I need to do something. I need to, keep myself busy. And, ultimately, I think that the meaning that I find is just in the challenges that present themselves with building a company, whether that's technical. I think a lot of developers will tell you the high that you get of cranking away at a problem, a certain bug that maybe takes 4 hours, and you're, banging your fists on the desk, and you really just can't find a way to get this damn, database to work with this workflow. And then all of a sudden it works. Those little wins are the kind of things that really just define life. You're just really just making a small series of challenges and you're making headway on them. So I think when building products, it doesn't really necessarily need to be the product itself that's driving most of the meaning. It can just be the actual day to day. And ultimately that's what you're spending the most of your time doing, right? You're just taking these little obstacles and building a business, and you're finding ways to solve them. And if you can find a way to enjoy that process and enjoy each step, then it's just going to be a much better experience. And you're probably going to be more successful because you're not hating the 10 hours a day that you're putting into it.
Yeah. It reminds me of BoJack Horseman, where Mr. Peanut Butter was talking and he had this quote. He said, "The universe is a cruel, uncaring void. The key to being happy isn't to search for meaning. It's to just keep yourself busy with unimportant nonsense. And eventually you'll be dead."
Well said.
Yeah, I think that's true in a sense of you just need to keep distracting yourself in a way, and you find something new to work on, even if it's a problem in a startup. Like, that is your meaning and you live for that. And so it's interesting to talk with founders who are able to cross that divide where they've sold their company, and the last 6 years of their life was all on this company, and then they're asking themselves, what do I do now? Because it can be a problem for a lot of founders who end up reaching that stage.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that on a more fundamental level, when you start a business, you're ultimately using that business as a vehicle for personal growth, because you have to learn so many different things to be able to execute well. So, a big staple for me in kind of finding meaning is just being in a continual state of growth, whether it's learning a new skill, whether it's figuring out how something works. And, I feel like there's a lot of hope in just recognizing how much you don't know. For example, picking up a book about physics and realizing, oh man, I know absolutely nothing about this topic, and this could be a really great thing to learn. Those kind of realizations, and keeping yourself not busy, but just keeping yourself growing and constantly learning. I think that's a great way to stay happy, because, you kind of find that inner peace.
Right. Now, I want to switch gears as we're nearing the end to go back on an earlier statement about coding, and that you came from a sales and marketing background and then you learned how to code. Now, firstly, I'm curious, do you think it's easier for a developer to learn the sales and marketing front, or is it easier for you as, say, a sales and marketing person to then learn how to code?
I think it's easier if you are a developer to learn sales and marketing. But I think what's hopeful is that there are tools coming online, especially in some of the low code and no code development space, that's making it easier for marketing and sales folks to kind of go the other way. The tough truth with development is that software is really hard to build, and the core concepts of coding, just learning the syntax of a language, it's pretty much just like learning another language. It's like learning Spanish. And, if you had a bad experience with a Spanish teacher in high school or college, you might have that same bad experience with a, computer science class you take on Udemy, because it's just really difficult. It's retraining the brain to think in a different way. And so, I think ultimately, if you're a developer, it's probably easier to pick up on sales and marketing skills, because those are the more human, right? You're just learning how to help someone, you're learning how to deliver value and solve problems. Whereas, battling with a computer to get your piece of code running and figuring out why it keeps breaking, that stuff just takes a lot of time, takes a lot of Googling, and just a lot of brute force to kind of get to a point where you're actually competent.
Now, how did you develop the discipline? So I've been trying to learn Python, and I've taken Code Academy classes. And then there's also a website, fantastic, called Team Treehouse. And I was taking their courses, but eventually sort of got to a point where it was like really difficult. And without having a tutor or a mentor or somebody holding me accountable, I just kind of dropped off it. And I want to go back into it to really learn Python and understanding programming language a little bit more. But did you go to a boot camp? Did you graduate from college in CS? How did you learn those development skills?
Yeah. So really, I think the trouble with a lot of do-it-yourself coding boot camps and online classes, even though the resources are great, the problem with a lot of them is that it's really difficult to get to a point where you have a small win, which I think is critical for learning any skill. So you take a skill like learning the piano, it might take maybe a couple weeks to first get your fingers on the keys and feeling good, but then ultimately you can start to play a song, and it might be a really crappy song or super basic. Maybe it's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but it's still a song. And and that kind of small win is really important when it comes to just like the psychology of learning and incremental progress. And the problem with coding, in my opinion, is that getting to that point where you can first demonstrate the skill is really, really difficult. Because if you go on Code Academy or Treehouse, you start coding and you learn a little bit of the syntax. And what you end up doing maybe 2 weeks in is you end up making like a glorified calculator or, spitting out numbers. And you're like, wait a minute, I want to be building a web application. The ultimate goal is to be able to build something that people can use, that uses data and sends things around the internet. Like, how come I'm basically building like a glorified tic-tac-toe game? And so, the real issue with just where coding is currently is that there's such a gap between when you first start learning and when you first get that, okay, this is how a web application works. This is my first piece of code that's up and running online. I can open it on my phone and I can see that I've connected to a database. This is really cool. So because you have to spend, I don't know, weeks and potentially months to get there, it can be really discouraging up front. And that's why I'm a huge fan of some of the no-code tech tools out there like Bubble, in that, they kind of shortcut the learning process a lot, because you can drag and drop something up on a screen and you can connect it to a database, even if it's something that's as basic as like Google Sheets. And ultimately, that's a much better process, because your web application might look like the web application version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Might be really, really bad, but you still see what that small win is like, and it pushes you to keep on going.
Yeah, I think small wins are incredibly important. And now you mentioned on Bubble. So as I understand it, Bubble is a service or a platform that would allow a non-technical person to effectively create their own app or their SaaS product. So can you describe Bubble and say the other options a little bit more? But actually, probably first, I'm interested in knowing, can a non-technical person who does not know how to code, can they create their own startup and SaaS product?
Definitely. Yeah. And what's interesting is that, the term non-technical, it's a complex one. If you're a non-technical founder, then, you probably still have some technical skills. Maybe it's just in Excel and you just don't know that can be applied to starting a company. And what I really like about tools like Bubble is that really it's a glorified PowerPoint slideshow that's on top of a glorified Excel spreadsheet. And, you're just dragging around elements and then hooking them up to a database. And so what ends up happening when you use one of these low code tools is that you end up learning, in a sense, the fundamentals of web and mobile app creation, which is, okay, here's the database. This is where everything in the app lives. Here's the front end. And then I need to create all these workflows in between the two to, update the data in the database and then to display that updated information to the user. And so what I really like about a lot of the options that are coming online right now is that, there's a variety depending on what type of app you want to build and also what type of, technical skills you have. So if you have absolutely no technical skills, but you just want to see if an idea is out there, you can use a tool like Card to just get a landing page up and drive traffic to it to see if people are interested in your idea. That's kind of the classic model of, okay, I'm going to just see if there's any interest. And then if there is, I can either attract a technical co-founder or I can use pre-orders to pay for the development, something to that regard.
And so that's CARRD.co.
Yes.
And so it's free. It's easy to create just a basic landing page and mention your service as a way, I assume, of seeing what interest people would have in that product.
Exactly. And yeah, and when it comes to landing page design, you can start to get the functionality to a point where it looks more like a traditional website with a backend, meaning, you can have form submissions, you can have some payment processing if you want to collect pre-orders, but ultimately a tool like Card is going to be a lot more focused on just getting your idea validated at a very high level sense. Whereas if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum and you're building something non-technical with a tool like Bubble, then you're actually going to have a database. You're going to have a fully functional app that can connect to APIs. And that's how you build something that's, closer to the actual application you want to build and can test with people. So there's really a wide range of these tools coming online. And I think it's ultimately where web development is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. It's just taking a while for the traditional languages like JavaScript. I'd say React is probably at the forefront right now with some drag and drop tools, but it's going to take a while for them to get there.
Mm-hmm. And so with all of these options, so we have Bubble. Can you name any other contenders, or would you say Bubble is like the best platform?
Yeah, so I'd say Bubble definitely has the lead, and they're the best by far, just because they've integrated a really easy to use backend system. The front end can be a little bit messy at times because one of the downsides to dragging and dropping things all over a page is that you don't get a clean layout like when you're just using something like Card that has a little bit more of a constrained system.
But just to clarify, a Card is simply to build a landing page, whereas
Yes.
Bubble would actually allow you to build your own app. So they're two different things.
Exactly. And the one tool I'll mention that sits between the two that I'm a big fan of is Webflow. And Webflow really just sits nicely in the middle because you can build a nice looking landing page like Card, but you can also implement a really basic backend. And a backend of an app you can just think of as any sort of data that gets dynamically updated on the page. And with Webflow, if you have, let's say, a series of blog posts, that's technically an app that's dynamic because you can add a blog post on the back end, and then all of a sudden your page that goes live gets updated with that blog post. And there are some people out there like Ben Tossell, who's running a great platform called MakerPad. He has a lot of great Webflow tutorials and Webflow projects where you can actually start to use that CMS, the content management backend, to make it mimic startup functionality. So for example, it can display a lot of different posts. It can display a lot of different projects, and you can build like a content curation site that looks like an app.
Yeah, I absolutely love Webflow. I switched over to it from WordPress, and it's been an absolute breeze to have all these various types of databases in one format that can be easily managed by an assistant. Whereas with WordPress, even I was using WP Engine, which I know them and they're great, they're fantastic. But with WordPress, it's still based on PHP, which is very old kind of code. And you end up having security problems. They have to update the Linux server. You're on a shared server, so your website can go down because somebody else is getting a DDoS attack. And you have issues with security plugins. When you update the security plugins, I would have to create this very complicated checklist so that when you update a plugin, they would have to go to every page of my website to make sure nothing broke. Because I would end up having situations where a plugin, if I had it on auto update, I would find out weeks later from a random website visitor that a part of my website wasn't working properly. And I had no idea this whole time because the only thing I was getting notification on is whether or not the website went down, like a ping check. But there's nothing that shows you if your website's partially broken or hacked because you had an insecure or outdated plugin.
Yeah, that seems to be happening more and more with WordPress, unfortunately. I think the problem with having such a huge platform like they do is that it's going to take them a very long time to fix that because they have to have backwards compatibility with all these sites. And I know just from digging into the code of their latest project, which is a new front-end editor, that is based on React and has some really good principles of JavaScript and some great principles of web development that are making things more secure, more fast. The only problem with it is that, you ultimately end up still having that PHP database. You can't get away from it. And that's going to slow you down in the long run. Like you said, you get all these security issues. And then, the great thing about WordPress is you have so many plugins. The bad side of it is you end up with 50 plugins on your site and you don't know which one's crashing it, or they all update and then everything breaks. So, I think Webflow, like you said, is a really, really great option in the no code space. And then if you are building with code, the platform I built launching myself on it's a React built site. And I built it with Gatsby, which is really just one of the most phenomenal pieces of technology I've seen recently. It's just it's like a static site generator on steroids. And Gatsby can actually take data from WordPress if you're using the WordPress API, or you can use one of these new content management systems like Contentful, and you can just plug it in and it's lightning fast, super secure, and kind of uses some of the next gen web concepts like lazy loading, statically displayed content. And so you end up with just super fast page load times.
Now, I want to get back to a little bit about Bubble. And so imagine if you're a startup founder or you have an idea for an app, you want to create it, but say your options are you can pay, maybe you have a couple $1,000s, you can go to some development firm in India and try and pay them to develop the app. And the horror story that I've heard a lot of the times is that you have somebody who didn't know how to code, hired these India guys or wherever they hired them from, and then they ended up getting a VC money or the app started to actually grow and scale. Then they had to go back and scratch the whole thing and develop it all from scratch because it wasn't scalable and they had so many problems and bugs with it. But at least they were able to use that to validate their idea. Now we have options with Bubble. So if I'm somebody, again, I no experience whatsoever, how long would it take for me as a single person, non-technical, to develop an app within Bubble? And what are the restrictions of a service like that versus, say, hiring somebody who can just, you list out all the features you want and then they just build it?
Yeah. So, I think the biggest challenge that I see with going from kind of the traditional model of hiring to building it yourself is, there's obviously going to be a learning curve. When you're outsourcing it, you can spend time doing other things in your business, marketing, coming up with landing page, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem with that, obviously, when you do outsource is that you end up with a product that you can't edit unless you either build it from scratch, like you said, or you go back to that same team and then maybe they charge you double, to make edits, or, suddenly they're not available. So you really are putting a lot of dependency on an outsourced team. And that's where you start to get into a lot of those horror stories that you end up with an application that maybe it works pretty great, but then you go to make V2 and then V2 is a disaster. So, I really think that the downside with Bubble is that you have to probably spend good couple weeks in the platform to get up and running, to get comfortable, because it is such a complex tool. It's, a non-technical tool, but, you still have to know fundamentals of web app design. There are a lot of good learning resources available now, which is great. And the real tricky thing is that you just have to spend your time well in the platform. So you have to, build small projects, the classic build your first to-do app so that you learn how to make something that, can interact with the database. You can check off a to-do, you can add a to-do. That's kind of the classic. And then, ultimately, if you do build something with Bubble, you end up getting a huge advantage in that. One, it can scale slightly farther because you're really going to need to rebuild maybe after you get tens of thousands of users, depending on what type of app you've built. But the ultimate benefit is that you can edit your application. So let's say you launch and you find out that conversion rate is pretty great on the homepage, but not the secondary page because users are concerned about, let's just say, the language of a button or even the color of the button. You can go in and you can make those changes without having to rehire a development team just to do that.
Right. And on a side note, I've seen there's two perspectives where you'll have, say, a startup and then they hire people who only come from a boot camp and they learn how to code very quickly. And the quality of the code isn't that great because they're pulling from, say, GitHub and all these repositories and resources. And they just try and create like a Frankenstein of a product because they don't know how to create the fundamental architecture of the actual software. And then you have people who go to college and get CS degrees and they know how to create a scalable product that's not not going to break because of X amount of users or what have you. And another example is I've seen people who will say that I don't know how to build a startup. I don't know how to code, so I'm not going to code because I'd have to go to college. I'd have to do all these things and it's going to take me a long time. And I think you need to look at what your priorities are. If your priority is to build a version 1.0 of a product to validate your idea, then maybe spending 3 months to try and learn basic code or to learn how bubble.is would work, and you can build something on your own. And then once it achieves success, then you can go out and hire somebody with a CS degree to redesign the architecture of your product and not have the mindset of, oh, I need to learn all these things before I can launch. And so I think there's a middle ground that you need to have of what your priorities are, of how much do you need to know versus what can you do as a minimal viable product to launch a startup.
Yeah, no, it's a good point about what you actually need to do to get off the ground. And obviously that's going to really vary depending on how complex the idea is. If you're building an application that uses machine learning or is super technical, relies heavily on a lot of different APIs, the foundation of your app is something that you want to be really strong, and it might make sense to hire an expert developer. But being objective as much as possible and saying, okay, if I build something with maybe 2 less features, but now I don't need to integrate with all these different services. Now maybe I could just build it with Bubble, get it off the ground, and then I can start to build, maybe rebuild at a certain point. It's really just all dependent on what your goal is, but ultimately it comes down to how much you want to put in yourself versus hiring and what your skill set is.
Now, on your website, launchingmyself.com, you detail all the projects that you have, what you're currently working on. You also have a newsletter. Now, if somebody's interested in building a startup, learning more about Bubble, do you have a blog post, a way on your website where they can go and kind of get information on that?
Yeah, so I'm probably going to be putting a lot more effort into my YouTube channel. I had probably 7 or 8 videos on how to build Bubble, and my education platform that I built had probably maybe 8 or 10 different courses in how to use Bubble. Those I all sold with the company last year, but I'm going to be putting up some more videos. I have one video now up on my YouTube channel that will address this. It's kind of just an intro to Card and Webflow and Bubble. But yeah, I think when it comes to what tool I use for the job, I try to just think about what the different requirements are and if it's best built with or without code. And so I do have a section on the website where I kind of detail that process. It's on the toolkit section. And so that's also a good place to find some info about, whether you should use Bubble or, stick to something with React or something, a traditional coding language.
Cool. And then I guess lastly is about self-confidence, about if somebody's wanting to develop an app, what would you tell them? Whether they should spend the next 6 months of their life building something or whether they should just continue at their job. How do you develop the confidence? Just say that you want to be a startup founder.
Yeah, I think, confidence is a pretty huge aspect of it, and it's hard to develop that skill. You really have to be someone who can cultivate that self-confidence. And I definitely don't think that entrepreneurship is for everyone. There are some people that are really just using entrepreneurship as a crutch to escape a job they don't like. Mm-hmm. And then there are people that, genuinely, which I think I'd put myself in the category, just, find that when they're working for themselves, it's kind of their highest calling and they can't see themselves going back to traditional employment. And so if you do realize that you're that kind of person and that, entrepreneurship's for you, it's really just taking it one step at a time and figuring out where you're lacking in your skills, and then just having a growth mindset of, okay, I'm not bad at marketing. I'm not bad at coding. I just don't know those things yet. And so I just need to figure out and put in place a system. Maybe it's, if you have a full-time job, maybe it's just 30 minutes a day. You just dive into Bubble. You'll start to build, some small applications. And then you realize, okay, I kind of get how web apps work. Now I'm going to go to Treehouse or another site and learn some concepts of PHP or JavaScript. You really just have to start somewhere. And so I think back to the beginning of my journey when, I was building basic WordPress sites, didn't know that much, just knew a little, basic HTML and CSS. And it's just a work in progress. You just have to constantly be developing those skills and then hope that over time, that collective wisdom builds into a set of skills where you can actually start a successful business.
Yeah, one step at a time, growth mindset. Brent, I absolutely love your newsletter. I've loved this interview. And if you haven't already, go to his website, launchingmyself.com, sign up for his newsletter too. I'll be following you and looking at you for helping me to figure out how to build my next app with Bubble. So thank you for being on the podcast, Brent.
Thanks for having me, Cody.
Hey guys, this is Cody again. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Mindhack. And if you're interested in getting more Mindhack-worthy stuff straight to your inbox, then you might consider signing up for my weekly newsletter. It often contains links to new episodes, blog posts, and other interesting finds I found on the interweb in the past week. It pretty much focuses around productivity and efficiency. So if that's your thing, then be sure to visit my website at codymclain.com. That's MCLAIN.com to sign up. Also, if there are any interesting websites, companies, books, blog posts, quotes, or anything else that was mentioned in this episode, you can find it all and more by visiting the official website for the Mindhack Show at mindhack.com. And as always, if you have any feedback, good or bad, I want to hear it. Send me a tweet, email, or what have you on either of my websites, as my goal with this show is to give you the maximum value in the shortest amount of time. That's all for now, guys. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you guys again soon.